Hello, this is Matt from Matt Heaney Apps, and welcome to the third episode in our series where we will show you how to make the full iPhone game disappear in disks. So far, we have our project set up, but now it's time to start making the game. So in this episode, what we're going to do, we will set up the start of the game with a background and a disk, and when you tap on that disk, a new random coloured disk will be spawned somewhere in the game. Okay, so let's jump back into Xcode to continue. So let's jump back into Xcode and we will jump into our game scene.swift. So this scene here is where we will code our game. And we are going to begin by setting up what you will see as soon as you move into the scene. So for now, when you move into the game scene, this is what you are going to see. We will have a background and the first disk to tap. So in the game scene, we will set up the didMoveToView function, and this function here is going to run as soon as we move into this scene. So any code between these two curly brackets is going to run as soon as this scene loads up. So here we will code for our background and for the first disk to appear. We will begin with the background. We will say let to declare something new, and we will call this background. This would be an SKSpriteNode, which is an image, and this will use the image disks background.png. This one just here. So we will say image named, and in speech marks we will say disks background, just like the file name. And because it's a .png, we don't have to say .png. But if it was a JPEG or any other format, we would have to include the file type. Make sure you have this here exactly what the file is called, otherwise you will get a big red cross for your background because it won't be able to find the image. So let's set up our background. So we will say background, the name that we gave it here, and we will give it a size, so .size equals, and we want this to cover the entire scene because it's the background. So we will say self.size. So take the size of the scene and set that to be the size of the background. We will give it a position, so background.position. And for the position, we need an X coordinate, so where it is across the screen, and a Y coordinate, so where it is up and down the screen. So we will say equals, and we will use a CG point, which is a template for the X and the Y. So we can put both of our coordinates in on one line. And by default, the position of a sprite node relates to the center of the image. So as this is a background, we want the center of the image to be the center of the scene. And to do that, we will set up all of our positions depending on the width and the height of the scene. Okay, so for example, for the X, we will take the scene, so self, take the size, and take the width, and divide it by 2. So it's going to figure out halfway across the screen. And for the Y, we'll do the same thing for the height. So now the background is positioned in the center of the screen. We want a Z position of 0, and this is the layering of the objects. So this will be the furthest back, which is important because if it's not at the back, some objects will be behind the background and you won't be able to see them. So this is our background now set up. All we have to do is tell Xcode to make it. So self.addChild and make the background, so background, like so. So we now have our background. So we now want our disk. So we will say let to declare something new. We will call this disk equals, again, it's a sprite node because it's an image, open bracket, image named. And when we spawn new disks a bit later on, we will pick one of the following at random. Okay, but to start with, I always want it to be disk 2 because it's red and my other company is called Red Sneakers Gaming, so it's a bit of a naughty plug. So back in the game scene, we are going to start with the image called disk 2, so it always starts with the red one. We haven't got to give this a size because the image was made in the right size, so it just used that for us. We will give it a position, again in the center of the screen, so CG point with the X being self.size.width divided by 2 to get halfway across the screen, and the y being self.size.height divided by 2 to get halfway up the screen. We want to give this a z position, so the layering, of 2, because in a later part we will set up our score label, which we want to be below the disks, so this will appear on top of it. And we also want to give this a name. So we're going to say disk.name, and we're going to call it diskObject. Now this we will use a little bit later in this video when we figure out if we have tapped on a disk. Okay, so this will be used in just a few moments actually. So this bit here will make more sense in just a few moments. And then add the disk to the scene by saying self.addChild and the name that we gave it, disk, like so. So now as soon as our scene loads up, we will have our background and we will have a disk. Now I always like to test stuff as I go, so we're going to test this right now. To test this, we'll move up to the top, select which simulator you want to use, or your actual iPhone or iPod Touch or iPad or whatever. I will use my actual iPhone and hit run. So this here is what we have so far. We have our background and we have our red disk. So back into Xcode, just a really quick heads up. In the log, if you're getting messages like this, don't worry about it. It's just Xcode stuff in the background. You're doing absolutely nothing wrong. Okay, so just ignore that. So what we got so far, you know, it's nice and pretty, it's working fine. It doesn't really do anything. So we will now move on to figure out if we have tapped a disk, and if we have, delete that disk and then create another disk. Okay, so you tap a disk, gets deleted, and a new one is then spawned. So in the game scene, outside of the didMoveToView function, so make sure you're not within this function here, otherwise it will not work, we will set up the touchesBegan function. Now this function here will run when you touch the screen. So any code between this bracket here and this bracket here will run when you touch the screen. So we want to know if we've touched the disk. So to get all that information about the touch, we're going to say for touch any object in touches, open curly bracket, drop a line, and it should put in a closing curly bracket for you, but if it doesn't, put that in now. So now, between these brackets here, we can use touch to figure out all of the information about where we've touched the screen. So to find out if we've touched the disk, we have to figure out 3 different things. Number 1, where we have touched the screen. Number 2, if that position matches the position of an object, and if it does match the position of an object, and therefore we've touched an object, figure out what object that is. So work out where we touched the screen, work out if we touched an object, and then work out if that object is a disk. So one step at a time, let's figure out where we've touched on the screen. So we will say let to declare something new, to hold some information for us. And we're going to call this positionOfTouch. And this will equal touch from here, dot location in node, open bracket, self, close bracket. So now positionOfTouch will be set to the position that we've touched the screen. From that, we can figure out if we have touched a node or an object. So let to hold some information, tappedNode equals node at point of positionOfTouch. Okay, so now tappedNode holds all that information about a node that we have now touched. So we now know if we have touched an object. All we got to do now is figure out what object that is. And for that, we are going to use the name that we gave to our disk. So we're going to pull the name from this object, and if that name is diskObject, then we have touched the disk. So again, we will say let, and we will call this one nameOfTappedNode equals tappedNode, this from here, .name. So now nameOfTappedNode is set to the name of the node that we have just touched, or the object that we have just touched. Now with that, we can use a simple if statement that says if nameOfTappedNode equals diskObject, which is this here, open curly bracket, drop a line. If it didn't put in a closing curly bracket for you, put that in. Normally it does, but mine didn't put one in for me, so just check that. If you get any errors, make sure you put your bracket in. So with all of this, we are now saying if we have touched the disk, do the code between these curly brackets. Okay, so if we have touched a disk, we want to do two things. We want to delete the disk that we have pushed, and we then want to spawn a new disk. So one step at a time, we will delete the current disk by saying tappedNode, this from up here, storing all that information about the objects that we have pushed, dot remove from parent. So now, if we touch a disk, delete that disk. So before we move on to spawn a new disk, let's test this out. So hit run. So this is our game so far. Tap somewhere which isn't the disk, nothing happens, and then tap the disk and it is deleted. So that is working nicely. So what we got to do now is spawn and make a new disk when we have tapped a disk to allow the game to continue. So back into Xcode, and we will now deal with spawning a new disk. So for this, we will make a brand new function. So find some room which is not within a function. We will say func, and we will call this spawn new disk. Like so. So now here, we'll have all of the code that we need to spawn a new disk, and then we will call this whenever we want to spawn a new disk. Now we will keep the first disk separate, the one that appears straight away, because these new disks, they will eventually shrink down to disappear. There'll be random colors and so on, so they'll be a little bit different. Okay, so in our brand new function, we want to start by declaring a new disk. But before we can do that, we want to set a few things up so the disk will be a random color. Because we have these four disks, the blue one, the red one, the white one, and the yellow one, and we want a random one to be used just to keep the game looking very arcadey. And you may have noticed these disks are called disk 1, disk 2, disk 3 and disk 4. So all we got to do is create a random number, either 1, 2, 3 or 4, and then use that number in the file name of the image that we want to use for our new disk. And that makes sense as we go, I promise. So in our new function, we will say var, a variable, and I'll explain why it's var, not let, in just a few moments. And we will call this random image number. And we will set this up as a random number. So arc for random, open bracket, close bracket, %, and because there's 4 possibilities, we will use the number 4. So random image number will be set to a random number pulled from 4 different possibilities, because we have 4 images. Now the only problem is, random number generators start with 0, and our disk images are disk 1, 2, 3 and 4. So at the moment, random image number will be set to 0, 1, 2 or 3. But we want it to be 1, 2, 3 or 4. So we will say random image number plus equals 1. To take that random number, add 1 to it. So now, random image number will be set to either 1, 2, 3 or 4. Okay, so this was var, not let, because let would not have let us change the value of random image number. It locks it in, but with var we can affect that value. So that is why this one is a var, var being short for variable, let being constant if you're wondering. So with that, we can now set up our new disk. So we will say let, we will just call this disk, equals SKSpriteNode, image named, and instead of saying disk 1 or disk 2, 3 or 4, we want our random image number to be part of this image name. So we will say / open bracket, random image number, close bracket. Okay, so now if our random number generator picked 1, it will use the image disk 1. If the random number was 2, it would use disk 2. If it's 3, it will use the image disk 3. And if it's 4, it will use the image disk 4. Okay, so now we're going to get a random image. We will give our disk a Z position of 2 to do with our layering, and the disk a name of disk object so we can tap it just like the starting disk. Now the big thing that we have to now do is give this disk a random position somewhere on the scene. Unfortunately, that's not as straightforward as it sounds, because the scenes by default are made in the same aspect ratio as an iPad. So this image here represents our scene, and as you can see, it fits an iPad screen. That's all well and good. So in theory, we could just plonk this new disk anywhere within the scene and it worked fine. But this is a universal game. So this is going to work on an iPhone as well. And because the aspect ratio of an iPhone is different to that of an iPad, some of the scene is actually off the sides of an iPhone. So you don't actually see all of the scene on an iPhone, as you can see in this graphic here. So if we was to just put a disk anywhere, it might not actually be on the screen of an iPhone at all. And if you don't tap this disk, it'd be game over. But if you can't see it, it's not exactly fair. So what we have to do is make a game area, which will only contain what can be seen on every single device. We'll then use this area to spawn the disk somewhere within this area, so then the disk will always be on every single screen rather than off the sides of an iPhone. Okay, so we now have to set up this game area. So what we will do is we will find some room and we will say let game area, and this will be a CG rect, so a rectangle. And we're making this global within the scene, so we can use this everywhere within the scene. So we're going to set this up in the scene initializer, and then we can use it everywhere. So we will now say override init. We want the one with the size. And because we're using the initializer, we have to include an extra bit of code. So if you find your error, it will suggest it for us and add it in like that. Be careful when selecting your error. Make sure you do not get a breakpoint, which looks like this. If you do get any of these blue arrows, right click, delete, because otherwise it will crash your app. So in the init function, we will say super.init size colon size. So this is now the structure of the scene initializer. This is the very first thing to run in the scene. And here we can set up our game area. So to set up our game area, the first thing we need is the max aspect ratio of a device, because that's going to help us with our calculations. So we'll say let max aspect ratio. This will be a CG float, so a decimal, be 16.0 over 9.0, so 16.9. I'll warn you now, stuff like this bit here, you normally use in a cheat sheet. So normally you just copy and paste into your projects. So if you're a little bit lost making this game area bit, don't worry about it, totally understandable. Even though I would use a cheat sheet for this, I think it's one of those areas that is so important. If we type it out, it might help you get your head around. So that is why we're going to type all of this out. So now that we have this aspect ratio, we're going to figure out the playable width. Because in portrait mode, the width is what you lose some of on the iPhone. You get the entire height of the scene on an iPhone, you just lose some of the width. So we're going to say let playable width. And to figure that out, we take the size and the height and divide that by the max aspect ratio. But by default, this playable area will start at the left-hand side of the scene. So as we don't get that left-hand side of the scene on an iPhone, we have to figure out the playable margin, which will be the gap down each side. So it's in the center of the screen, so it's actually the iPhone screen. Let game area margin equals, and to figure that out, we're going to take the width of the scene and take away the playable width to find the difference between the width of the iPhone screen and the width for the side of the scene, and divide it by 2 because we have a margin down each side. And then what we got to do is set up our game area. So game area equals CG rect. So the X, so where this game area will start going across the screen, is the game area margin. Y will be 0 because it will be the bottom left hand corner of the game area and it will start on the bottom of the screen. The width will be the playable width, and the height, because we get all of the scene on every device, will just be size dot height, like that. Okay, so this here is just setting up the game area, which is an area that fits on every device screen that we're now going to use to spawn the disks in, so we know the disk always appears on every single device. Okay, I hope that makes sense. This is one of those areas I think is really hard to explain, and when you're learning, it's hard to get your head around. But when you get your head around it, it kind of just clicks. Okay, so if you have any questions about that, post a comment and I'll be happy to help. This is one of the tricky things to get your head around when you're starting out. But like I said, normally between you and me, you would just copy and paste that into your project. So we now have our game area. So back in our spawn new disk function, we now want to find a random position within that game area for our new disk. Now there's a few different ways we could set up a random number generator to find our random position. So we could use this arc4random, but instead we're going to use what I like to call utility functions to do all the hard work for us. And then we can just put in two values as a minimum and a maximum value, and it will just pick a random value for us between these two values. And that will make it super easy for us to find a random position somewhere within the game area. So to do this, what we're going to do, go down to the video description and grab this code here and paste this in. Always really easy to mess this up if you type it in, so I always actually recommend copying and pasting this in. And this here, it's as if you won't even notice this is here. We're going to use this and it will do all the hard work for us. Okay, so with that, we can now pick a random value between a minimum and a maximum range. So we now have our game area and our random number utility functions. So let's get this random position. So in our function, we want a random X position and a random Y position. So we'll say let random X equal, and then using our new functions, we can say random, open bracket, min, colon, and we can give it a value, and we can give it a maximum value, and it will now pick us a random value between this range. Okay, so the minimum value is going to be the furthest left-hand point of the game area. So cgrect get min x of the game area. And the maximum value is going to be the furthest right-hand point of the game area. So cgrect get max x of the game area. Let's just tidy this up so it's easier to read, like so. So we now have a random X being picked between somewhere between the furthest left-hand point of the game area and the furthest right-hand point of the game area. And we can only use this minimum, maximum because of our utility functions that we just pasted in. We will now do the same kind of thing for the Y. So let random Y equals random, open bracket, min will be cgrect. This time get min y, because this will be the lowest point of the game area, comma, and the max will be cgrect get max y, which will be the highest point of the game area. So now random x will be set to a point between the furthest left in the game area and the furthest right of the game area, and random y will be a random value between the lowest point of the game area and the highest point of the game area. So using these values, we can now give our new disk a random position. So by saying disk.position equals cg point for our x and our y, with the x being random x, so our random point going across the screen, and the y being random y, so our random point going up and down the screen. So this would give it a random position, and you would think that would be it working perfectly, because it now gives it a random position somewhere within the game area, and that game area is an area that would be on every single device. Just one small little problem, because this random position relates to the center point of the disk. And if, for example, our random number generator, if that selects, say, the furthest left-hand point of the screen, half of the disk would then be off the screen, because the center point of the disk would be the furthest left-hand side of the screen. So we're going to make a few tiny adjustments to this to make sure the disk stays fully on the screen at all times. So let's start with our random x, and the minimum, so before the comma, we will take the minimum x of the game area, and we will add half of the width of the disk. Okay, so now it will always stay fully on the screen. We've kind of squished that range in a bit, so the disk will always stay fully on the screen. For the maximum, we will take away half of the disk, So it's going to kind of take a little bit off the furthest right hand point so the disk always stays on the screen. For the Y minimum, we will add half the size of the height. Again, to kind of squish that range in just a little bit so that the disk stays fully on the screen at all times. And for the max, we're going to take away half the height so that it always stays on the screen. Okay, so now we have our random X, our random Y. The disk always stays on the screen. The disk now has this random position. All we got to do is now add it to the scene by self.addChild disk. And that there is the code that we need to spawn the random disk. It will have a random image and it will be in a random position somewhere within the game area, which is an area that will be on the screen of every single device. That felt like a lot of hard work to spawn a disk. All we got to do now is when we tap on the disk and we have deleted a disk, is spawn a new disk by saying run this function here. So it would take this, it will find this function and it will run this code for us. And that there is how we spawn a new random coloured disk in a random position. So we now test this out. Very important to test this out. There's a lot in there that could have gone wrong, especially if this is one of your first Sprite Kit projects or any of this is new to you. So always test as you go. So let's hit run and check it out. So this is what we have so far. If you tap anywhere else on the screen that isn't a disk, nothing will happen. If you tap on a disk, it will be deleted and a new disk with a random colour will spawn in a random position, always fully on the screen. And already you can see the game starting to take shape. So already you can see the game starting to come together. Next time we will deal with the score system and a leveling system. So as always, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed watching this video, which I really hope you did, hit like, hit subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.